The temple was so busy that day. It often was in the lead up to Passover. People have to pay their temple tax and the sacrifices have to be made. But it always made it worse for me, because I was in the thick of it, doing my best to worship God. Yep, me. I know, I'm not a Jew. In a lot of ways that's part of the problem. But having lived there and seen the way they lived their lives, I'd come to admire them and their way of life. I'd become a convert, what they call a Gentile. Although at times I wondered why. I was always second class as far as most Jews were concerned. I was always treated with some suspicion. Well, I suppose you are when you're an invader, aren't you? And that's how they see us. And there were always the restrictions on the temple. What, you've never been? Well, like me, you won't be able to visit much of it. Only the priests are allowed in the central part, the Holy of Holies, anyway. Even then, it's only on special days, and there's more parts where the priests are. But then you go a bit further out, and there's a place where the men of Israel are allowed to be. And then there's the court of the women. And then, finally, there's the court of the Gentiles, where people like me are allowed to gather. Woe betide if you try and get any further in, though. They're allowed to put you to death. So no further than that did I dare go, really. Normally it wasn't too bad, but with Passover so close, it was a real problem. Because the court of the Gentiles was also where the traders and the money changers were allowed to set up. It wasn't straightforward, you see. The temple tax had to be paid in the right money, and normal Roman currency just wouldn't do. You had to go and get the special coins from them. And the animals for the sacrifice, well, they've got to be perfect, without blemish. Especially if you live in the city, it's an awful lot easier to just buy the animal there, knowing that it's absolutely acceptable and spot on, and you'll be fulfilling the law, because you've got to offer your best to God. But for me, well, can you imagine how difficult it is to worship when around you is a market with live animals in it? Forget hearing the priests far away in their own courts. You could barely hear yourself speak as you attempted to recite the prayers. But then, suddenly, there was even more commotion than usual. There was a man there. There was anger in his eye. And he was shouting and raging, turning over the tables. And he was shouting and raging, turning over the tables, driving them out and stopping the people who just used the court of the Gentiles as a shortcut. This is a house of prayer for all nations, he was shouting, not a den of robbers. I was amazed. And then I was delighted, because this was a Jew. Someone who could have just scrolled through that gate. And what he was saying to my ears was that he wanted people like me to be able to worship God just as much as his own people. And then it struck me. This must be this rabbi that they had all been talking about, the one who'd arrived yesterday with a big crowd behind him. And I could see why they'd follow him. What he was saying held me captivated. And not only because he seemed to be saying that I and people like me were important to God too. There was that something there, whether force of personality or something deeper that just made you want to find out more about him. Afterwards, they came back, of course. The money changers, the men selling their birds in baskets, ready for the sacrifice. But they were more subdued. You got the feeling they knew this wasn't going to be the end of the matter. In fact, one or two of them actually moved further out towards Solomon's porch. What was strange, though, was that even though there was an awful lot of muttering about what had happened, he was allowed to walk free. It was like they didn't dare lay their hands on him. A few would have liked to, I'm sure. Some of the chief priests looked pretty angry. And unlike this man, whose anger seemed a sort of holy thing, theirs seemed much more ominous. They didn't dare do anything to him because there was that big crowd around him. And it was obvious that there were plenty that thought that what he was saying was well worth listening to. This rabbi, Jesus his name was, you'd better watch out though. You can tell that the temple authorities don't like him, and they'll be out to get him. Me though, I want to find out more about him. I want to see what he'll do next.
Lord, whose concern is that all people may come to know God, help us to be people who point the way to you. Forgive us for the times we have put obstacles in the path of others, and show us again the grace that is sufficient for each one of us to know eternal life. Amen.